I've got an amplifier to repair once again. This is a cheap one, an entry-level, what I would call prosumer-grade amplifier. It's in a professional form factor, but has more of consumer-grade components on the inside. Some of you have probably seen these around before. This is a Gemini X3. I'm not sure who normally sold this brand, but I know it's, this brand has been around for a very long time. Probably the first professional form factor amplifier that I can bend the metal casing by hand. It's so thin. I bought this on eBay for $25, non-working condition, just to try and fix it out of curiosity. So let's have a look inside and see how cheap this thing really is. Here's the back panel. It's very thin metal. Once again, I can bend it by hand. And these binding posts, this thing got so banged up in shipping, and they had the binding posts were loose and the metal inserts were poking out the back on a couple of them. But I was able to turn these down till they stopped and then keep going, keep tightening them more, and it pulled the metal back into the plastic. So I got those straightened out. Power consumption 1200 watts. Yeah, if you're driving it into clipping on a 2 ohm load, maybe with a 80% duty square wave, either that or it's very inefficient. Inside there's a fairly decent sized transformer, but undersized 6800 microfarad filter caps rated at 80 volts. Not much for a circuit board. The output transistors must be on the bottom of this heatsink. Well, let's test it out and see what's wrong with it. Well, I found that the voltage selector was on 230 volts, so I switched that back to 120, and it does power up. However, clip LED is on all the time on channel 2. Nonetheless, the protection circuit did disengage and clicked in the relay, so it should be able to pass a signal. I'm going to check for DC offset at the speaker terminals first to make sure that it's safe to hook my speakers up, and if that looks okay, I'm going to put a signal into it just out of curiosity and see how bad it sounds, and from there I'll start troubleshooting. Yeah, that cooling fan's noisy, that's for sure. Also stopped pretty quick. The bearings must be getting bad. Yeah, check out how well this protection circuit works. I got about half a volt of DC offset on that channel that has the clip light on. And the other channel, really nothing abnormal, but still blows my mind that it allows this to happen. Crazy. But I'm thinking that it's going to be something in the front end, because usually when the output transistor shorts, it just blows the fuse. So maybe this will be a simple op amp replacement or something. Can only find out. One reason I bought this amp, despite how cheap it was because I do have the full service manual that includes very clear schematics, and it also uses a pretty conventional design with little to no surface mount parts in it that should be able to fix it pretty easily. And the front end of the amp is all op amp based. The first stage here is capacitor coupled, so unless one of those caps are leaky, it's very unlikely that that's going to cause any DC offset. However, the next stage over is DC coupled right to this transistor. So I'm going to check at pin 7 of both of these op amps, compare the DC level between the two channels, and see if the one on that bad channel has DC coming out of it. And if not, I've just got to work farther down the stages until I find a voltage that is not equal between the two channels, and that'll tell me where to look for the problem. So let me start by checking pin 7 on these op amps and see what I get. I'm really starting to suspect that this op amp is leaky. After a minute, the clip light turns off and the voltages go back to matching the other channel. But I found that when the clip light is on, I have negative 1.6 volts at pin 7 on this op amp here, and normally it sits at positive 1.6 volts when I compare it to the other channel. And when the clip light turns off, it does go back to positive 1.6 volts like the other channel. And when the clip light is on, I also have 0.4 volts at pin 6. And the other channel normally has nothing. And I think the reason that I have the voltage at pin 6 there on that input is, if I follow this line over, it's actually connected to the speaker output. So this appears to be the negative feedback loop for that stage. And since I have nothing coming in on pin 5, which is the signal input, I really think that this op amp is leaky and is partially turning on this stage here, which is in turn causing DC at the output stage, which is getting fed back in to pin 6. So I'm going to try swapping that op amp and see if the problem follows it. I also found that the heatsink is hot to the power supply. It has negative 71 volts on it. Found out when I went to see how warm the heatsink was, and got a nice tingle. So I'm not sure if that's normal or not. There may be something shorting out to the heatsink. And as much as this casing can flex and twist this board, I'm not surprised if something is a little bit out of whack with the mounting. So let me get the board out of the chassis and have a look underneath. Despite how cheap this thing is, at least it appears to have genuine Toshiba output transistors, the 2SC5200 and 2SA1943. They're actually the same ones that are used in that KLH receiver that I fixed some time ago and took to work with me. And the power supply voltage on the heat sinks is normal for this because they're not using any insulators on the collectors of the transistors. They're just directly attached to the heat sinks, and there's actually 2 heat sinks, so that explains that. The board's not mounted in this thing very well at all. It's just got 3 plastic standoffs in the middle, one of which is broken off, and there's a couple screws in the front. Other than that, the board is supported on the back edge entirely by the input and output terminals. I'm really amazed that these plastic frames aren't broken on these banana posts with how much damage these things sustained in shipping. Equally so for the 1/4-inch input jacks. These things are very flimsy, and I'm really surprised the solder joints aren't completely broken. But there are some solder joints that don't look so good on these output transistors and some other components, so I'm going to touch up anything that looks suspect on that. And while I'm down here, of course, I'm going to swap these 2 op amps. I really wish I had some IC sockets I could use, but unfortunately I don't think I do, so I'm going to have to possibly remove this board more than once while I'm doing the repair. Yeah, this thing, I can also tell how old this is now. Copyright Gemini 2001, so it is pretty old. But let me get these problems fixed and we'll see if the symptom changes at all. Well, this is certainly getting interesting. I swapped both op amps with some new ones, and the problem stayed exactly the same. However, I found out that if I move the selector switch to bridge mono, it stops messing up, and it'll stay normal regardless of where I set the switch until the next time I turn it on. If I leave it in mono, I can power cycle it all I want, and it doesn't mess up. So something really funny is going on with the input stage, and I know it's not the op amps, so this will be fun to troubleshoot. This just keeps getting weirder. Check this out. Put this back up here. notice how the clip lights are on and the signal light for both channels. If I just barely nudge the potentiometer for channel 1, signal lights go out and that clip light goes out. It doesn't matter where I set it. The next time I turned it on, that time it actually didn't do it. Maybe I didn't wait long enough. Signal LEDs are just on. Yeah, see now I probably won't do it since I'm recording, but every time I would turn it on, the lights would be back on until I just nudged that control and they would shut right off. So it goes again. Just nudge it a bit and it's like there's an oscillation. I haven't put the scope on it yet, but I wonder if there's something causing a funky oscillation in it. Didn't really surprise me. I also found out that if you disconnect the cooling fan, the protection circuit won't disengage. So it's got some sort of sensor on it. Well, I gotta take a break, but I'll come back to this in a little bit. I need to get something to eat. Yeah, this is definitely a speaker killer. Check this out. Major oscillation going on, and according to my meter, it's running at the full output swing of the amp, about 64 volts and 25 kilohertz. The other channel, that explains why the signal LED is on the first channel as well. Second channel has a lot higher voltage oscillation going on, but it's also bleeding through onto the first channel at about 25 volts. And it's not clipping the other channel, but it's the same. See, this is the bad one here. And on the other channel, you can see the same oscillation, but it's not running at enough voltage to drive all the way to clipping. So, for some reason, there's an oscillation. And I hate tracing these things down. I've got a couple of crown amps up there that have oscillation problems that I have not been able to fix, and I hope this isn't another one of those things that really throws me for a loop, because this decides to stop doing that at random, you know. Flip that switch right there, all the problems go away. I'm wondering if there's a maybe one of these small ceramic capacitors or something for decoupling is not working. Sometimes I can turn it down and it'll work perfectly fine. Sometimes it oscillates. So just got to keep troubleshooting and see if I can trace down what's causing it. But at least I know now that it's actually an oscillation problem and not a DC offset problem. More interesting problems. I've got my signal generator hooked up and I've been probing around with the oscilloscope. Found out that channel 1 does pass a signal, but channel 2 does not, and I found it's actually coming into the volume control here and absolutely nothing coming out. And the potentiometer doesn't feel broken, but I'm wondering if this thing is oscillating because it's you know, got an open circuit on the input, and maybe that makes it unstable. I don't know at this point, but I'm going to take a closer look at that potentiometer and see if I can at least get a signal to pass through channel 2 and troubleshoot after that. Well, unfortunately, I finally managed to kill one of the tweeters in my bench speakers that I loved so much. When I first hooked this thing up and tested it and was not aware of the oscillation, it put a 64 volt 25 kilohertz waveform into that speaker and took out the tweeter instantly. So whether or not one of my spares is going to be a good match to that, I don't know, but that really ticks me off. These speakers have been one of my favorite sets to listen to for a long time, and now I'm minus one tweeter. better be able to fix this thing and make it worth that. Doggone it. Well, as crazy as it sounds, I think the gain controls were actually the problem. The one for channel 2 had an open wiper, so it was presenting no resistance to the second stage of the op amp, and this other one over here was flaky, and that's why every time I nudged it, it would go in and out of oscillation. And now that I've bypassed them and got it wired so that they're full volume all the time, everything is perfectly stable. Really unfortunate that the circuit had to be designed in such a way that giving an open circuit to the second stage of that op amp would send it into oscillation. But it's working fine now on both channels. Now these speakers really drop off below about 40 hertz or so. But yep, killed my left tweeter and had a lot of headaches troubleshooting this for what was a really stupid problem. And I would have never expected that. I've never seen an amplifier that would get so unstable from defective potentiometers for the gain controls, ever. Blows my mind. Apparently, we'll see the signal comes in, goes through the first section of the op amp, and then goes through the potentiometer and a series capacitor, and then comes back and goes into the second stage of the op amp. And like I said, for whatever reason, apparently it expects at least 10K of resistance on its input path, or it goes completely nuts. So I guess that's really one of the downsides of using a cheap amplifier like this. Not only is the performance going to be kind of subpar, but they can outright be dangerous for your speakers. And hate to know how many speakers this thing blew up in the past, but never thought I'd see the day that I actually killed one of these. But I think that's all that was wrong with this amp, believe it or not. So I'm going to wrap up this video, and maybe I'll have a video of replacing that tweeter when I get around to it. It's going to be down for a while because I'm busy with other stuff now. So this video was a little bit dumb, actually. Didn't really get anywhere, and probably one of the most confusing problems I've run into with an amplifier. And I can't believe that an open potentiometer would cause such a problem with an amplifier like this. But whatever. Well, what can I say? It works now, but it's still a total piece of crap, especially since it killed my speaker. And boy, only having one tweeter working really kills the stereo sound field, I tell you. Makes it seem like mono, really. If you're wondering what this gizmo is here, this is actually a preamp board out of an old Marantz receiver, and I'm feeding it with 32 volts DC from this old HP printer power supply. Works great as an EQ for using on the bench. I was just using my phone there to play some music. I'm too lazy to turn the computer on over there and wire that up right now. I'm probably still going to put this thing to use with some application that doesn't require the gain controls on the amp, because, you know, now that that problem's fixed, it does actually sound decent, but it's always going to be a piece of crap, obviously, and I'm always going to have a grudge against it now after it blew my tweeter out on my sacred test speakers. But I think I'm going to wrap this video up. This has definitely been an odd one for me. It's been a confusing and frustrating and rather infuriating project at times.